Good day to you, Vikings Nation. This is Justin and Mike on the Purple Code. We're going to have a little debate because at the end of the day, there are so many other people like our guy Rick and all of the other media members who are covering training camp. So we're going to throw a little something different at you here today. But before we get started, as always, we got to throw some love to our sponsors here. We're going to talk about Rinaldi's Pizza and Pasta in Woodbury, right on Wood Lane Drive there, and that's off of the intersection of I-494 and Valley Creek Road. Also want to give a quick thank you to our newest sponsor, and that is Nautical Bowls in Woodbury. They're located on Hudson Place, right off the intersection of Wisconsin and I-94. Mike, now that we got the housekeeping items out of the way, how are you, sir?
I'm doing good, man. The Fives are good. I'm happy with the new coach, obviously. I'm looking forward to the season. I'm pumped. Can't wait.
No question about it here. So, again, just to let people know, we are still working on our schedule, but we're going to have almost daily coverage once the regular season begins. We'll have a variety of different shows, variety of different hosts, variety of different opinions. Rick and Joe are doing a Wednesday night, what they call it, the Crazy Eight, because
the Great Eight.
Grade 8, excuse me. Great, crazy. You can take your pick. 6 and 1, half dozen of the other. But at the end of it all, they have just finished episode 2. And if you haven't checked them out yet, please do. They are available on all of our platforms, Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook, as well as all of the shows moving forward. So what are we doing here today, Mike? I'm just curious.
So we're going to do a debate on who is the second best quarterback in Vikings history, in our personal opinions, between Kirk Cousins and former Vikings quarterback Daunte Cullpepper.
Just to be clear, it's third because we still got to have Tommy Kramer in there between.
I will go second to me, but third for you, that's fine.
All right. That's another debate that we can have. So there you go. So before we get started, I want to make sure to be very, very clear here. This is not a debate about Kirk Cousins and what he is or isn't. That topic has been played out ad nauseum. We just wanted to throw in a little bit of a different curveball here on top of the normal training camp coverage. Again, follow us on the Purple Code 1 on Twitter. Hit that like and subscribe buttons on YouTube, Facebook, so that you get the notifications when any of our shows go live. So we're going to start off with a little of something like this. And yes, unfortunately, I couldn't figure out how to run the show without it being blank. So you're going to see this nonsense on the side. So the question on the table is, where do they rank all time? Again, I have Daunte at 3 and Cousins at 4. You've got them at 2 and 3 respectively. So let's get down to it here. I call Daunte Cullpepper the roller coaster. Why? Because he has his up years and he has his down years. His regular season record was just under 500. He's gone 2 and 2 in the playoffs, and he has reached the NFC Championship game back in 2000. Now, I did a compilation of their best seasons passing and rushing. So Daunte, of course, was the second in MVP in 2004, only to Peyton Manning, who at that point had just broken almost all of Dan Marino's records. But he had 4,700 yards plus and a touchdown interception ratio 3.5 to 1 with 39-11. And he led the league also in completions at 379. You know, his rushing stats in his best year was 2003 for 609 and 10 touchdowns. His best regular season record was 11-5. And again, that was the 2000 season where they lost in the NFC Championship game. Now, conversely, we call Kirk Cousins the train. Why? Because he's consistent. Good, bad, or indifferent. He is on that straight line. And, you know, Daunte's got roller coasters up and down. Again, we know that Kirk Cousins is about a 500 quarterback officially in games started for the Vikings, 33-29-1 for a 52.4 percentage. 1-1 in the playoffs, won that wild card game in New Orleans in overtime with that great pass to Thielen and then Rudolph, then lost the next week of the divisional round. Looking at, you know, Kirk Cousins' best season, it at the end of it really is a matter of interpretation because he had some years with more yards. He had some years with more touchdowns. So I kind of tried to do the best I could to do a compilation here. So we got almost 4,300 yards with a 6-1 touchdown to interception ratio, 425 completions. Those were all in 2018. As far as rushing yards, his best was 2020 with 156-1. And again, we talked about his best regular season record was 10-5. So, Mike, before we get started, you had said earlier that you're taking Cousins. Help me understand before we dive deeper into the minutia on this as to why you're taking him.
So it's many factors, and I'll get into it very quickly. It's the offensive line. You had two Pro Bowlers, Cullpepper in 2000, with Corey Stringer, who unfortunately has passed away many, many years ago. So rest in peace to him. And center Matt Burke. Cousins has had one Pro Bowler his entire career along that offensive line in Minnesota. With Brian O'Neill just last season. And the coaching. I mean, at the end of the day, you will only go as far as your head coach quarterback relationship will take you. And, you know, we can go back forth here, but I think Denny Green, who was there a good chunk of time in Cullpepper's career with Minnesota, is just far better than Mike Zimmer when it came to building an offense and actually supporting his quarterback. And Zimmer never wanted to. And that's the difference. Denny Green cared for his players. He loved his players. Defense, offense, special teams. Zimmer did not. And I think that's the big thing for me. Zimmer just was never in favor of Cousins. He never wanted to back him like he should have, like a proper coach would have. And that's the difference for me. They're very similar quarterbacks, but I just give Cousins the edge.
Well, I'm going to take the other side to that, and we're going to talk about offensive lines, defenses. Let's get the coaching one out of the way. So let's make sure we all understand. Denny Green was there for the first two seasons of Daunte, 2000, 2001. And Mike Tice, good old offensive line coach, who was never an offensive coordinator, got promoted right to head coach because of good old cheapo Red McCombs. Now, so he had two different coaches in his 5-season tenure. Now, yes, Mike Tice was on the Denny Green staff the entire time for the most part. So I will agree partially with what you're saying. I agree that between the three head coaches, that Denny Green is by far the best one. And I love Mike Tice, and I would take him back as our offensive line coach today, is how much respect I have for that. But as a head coach, he's clearly number 3. Now, let's talk about your guy, Mike Zimmer. We all know how much you appreciate and love that guy. Listen, nobody here is going to absolve Mike Zimmer from all of the issues that have come to light. Bad working environment, just not believing in Kirk and only being focused on the defense. And frankly, by the last year, you know, he knew he was on his way out and he was just kind of a curmudgeon. No doubt about that. But before we label Mike Zimmer as the head coach where quarterbacks go to die, let's just go through real quick what he has had. In 2015, he had Teddy Bridgewater, who everybody wants to tell me is mediocre at best, and how Kirk Cousins is so superior to him. And I don't necessarily agree or disagree with that other than leadership. But he won a division at 11-5. You can say, yeah, the defense was pretty good that year. But at the end of the day, it was Teddy Bridgewater as the quarterback, should have won in the wild card game, but for Blair Walsh. And at the end of the day, for me, let's look at the next 2 years. Teddy gets hurt. We trade for Sam Bradford. Had a career year here as one of Mike Zimmer's quarterbacks. Next year, 2017, we all remember Case Keenum. While it was a magic carpet ride, that was a career year for him too. And regardless, listen, nobody will argue, and we didn't need Ben Lieber to tell us that Cousins and Zimmer didn't get along, that Zimmer didn't like Cousins, that Zimmer didn't want a high-paid quarterback because he knew his defense would erode. All of that being said, Kirk Cousins has had his best season here in Minnesota under Mike Zimmer. So before we throw all the shade at Mike Zimmer, who we both agree his time had come and gone, let's remember that he has had 4 quarterbacks have their career years here. Now, having said all that, let's get back to the old statistics here. We're going to start here with the offensive lines. Okay? Again, we're comparing the 5 seasons that Daunte had meaningful here, which is 2000 through 2004. And again, we're right now doing the 4 seasons of Kirk Cousins. Now, this is a debate that could be had after this season when they both have had 5 years as the quarterback of the Minnesota Vikings. To your points about the offensive lines, let me be very clear and concise and simple with this. All 5 seasons of Daunte Cullpepper's offensive lines were better than all 4 seasons of Kirk Cousins' offensive lines. There is zero debate on that. You talked about, the Pro Bowlers that one versus the other has had. Again, Mike Tice was an offensive line coach by trade. The unfortunate passing of Tony Sperano completely threw the offensive line in chaos during Kirk Cousins' first year. So no doubt about that. We don't need to rank which one is which. All we need to say is that 1 through 5 are Daunte's and 6 through 9 are Kirk Cousins. So that makes the advantage Kirk Cousins in this particular instance. Mike, I'm going to go out on a big limb and guess, because you mentioned it earlier, do you agree with that assessment, or is there anything else that you think should be pointed out here one way or the other?
No, I 100% agree. The only thing I would say is I do think people don't give enough credit to Brian O'Neill. I mean, he is special. He is a really, really good player. And I do want to give him a lot of credit here before I completely bash the offensive line. But at the end of the day, Cousins played with offensive linemen like Pat Elflein, Drew Samia, Dakota Dozier, and Garrett Bradbury. Daunte has not been anywhere close. Daunte's offensive lines had nothing close to those type of players in the best way possible.
No, I totally agree. We're going to concede that particular point to Cousins here, most definitely. Now, here's the next one, and we're going to have some fun with this. Who had the better defenses? And again, we're talking about 18 through 21 and then 2000 to 2004. I'm going to say that the 5 seasons of Daunte Cullpepper, those defenses weren't bad. They weren't horrific. They were completely awful. Now, to some of you who may not have seen Daunte Cullpepper play, or maybe came in at the end of his era, you're going to say right off the bat, well, the last 2 seasons of this Vikings defense has been atrocious. Yes, it has. As atrocious as those 2 defenses were, which, by the way, they were still good in 18 and 19. Those by far are the 2 best seasons. But just like the offensive line completely goes to Daunte, the defenses, despite the last 2 years, go to Daunte. I will say one more time. The team that got to the NFC Championship game before losing 41 donuts had a horrific defense. Yes, you had John Randall and Ed McDaniel on their last legs. You still had Robert Griffin exiting his prime, but you had Robert Tate, a converted wide receiver, as one of your cornerbacks. You had some guy named Waswa Sarwanga. If you don't know who that guy is, that's not all that shocking. But he was playing in that NFC Championship game and a better portion of that season. Yes, by the time 2003 came around, when the Vikings originally signed Antoine Winfield, okay, you had some better corners. But by that particular time, your defensive line was mediocre at best. Your linebacking core didn't have any names of reference. So all my point is this. Yes, Daunte had better offensive lines, and we're going to get to the skill position players here in a moment. But I contend that despite, as I said, how awful the defenses were the last 2 seasons, I would still take and rank the 4 Cousins seasons defensively all ahead of all 5 seasons of Daunte. Mike, what say you?
Obviously, you knew I would disagree with this. And this is the thing. 2018 and 2019, there's no conversation. The defenses were far better on Cousins' end. And I'll go as far to say Cousins probably should have gotten the Vikings to the playoffs in 2018 with that defense. Now, was it all his fault? No, but they probably should have made the playoffs both those years. But the last 2 years, I will definitely say no, because though those defenses in 03 and 04 were not good, and I'm not sitting here saying they were, they did have an Antoine Winfield, and they didn't have historically bad 2-minute off defense. They were historically bad. The last 2 years, they broke the record twice. That's all I got to say. The 2-minute defense on its own was so bad, it has to be considered worse in my mind, just because it cost us so many games. Look at Arizona, look at Cincinnati, look at Detroit. That defense, the last couple of years, especially even 2 years ago, Tennessee and Seattle, that defense is far worse. I will just concede that I cannot give any credit to that defense whatsoever. The last 2 years, it's worse in my opinion.
Well, I'm going to say this to last year's defense. No question about it. It was atrocious under 2 minutes, both half and full game. Having said all that, there were times where the offense could have put them in better positions to not be in so many times where they were giving up, late game scores in the fourth quarter. There is no debate other than a couple of turnovers that happened towards the end of the first half, there is no debate about the end of the half. That all being said, yes, they should have still beat Cincinnati had, Dalvin Cook not been called for a fumble. That is debatable. Yes, despite of everything against Arizona, you had a field goal kick to win it. But I'll remind people, the final score of that game was 34-33 because of also a missed extra point. Okay, the defense gave up 34 points. But part of that 33 points that the Vikings scored was a pick six. So 7 of those points actually came defensively. In that game, the first 4 possessions, the Vikings scored 3 touchdowns. For the rest of the game, the offense scored 2 field goals. Yes, should have been 3. But I'll say again, you had a lead and you had a defense give you a defensive touchdown. Part of the reason that defense gave up that game is because you didn't do anything offensively for the next 3 quarters. And I will say this, the Vikings offense last year, good, bad, or indifferent, and I know we can throw all kinds of crap at Clint Kubiak, who was beyond overmatched. That offense led the league in 3 and outs. That's going to hurt your defense every bit as much as anything else. It's not as bad as a turnover on your half of the field, but when you are getting off the field and you've only got 2 minutes to rest because your offense went 3 and out, that has to be factored in. I'm not saying that that's the end all be all, but that has to be factored in. And oh, by the way, we can talk about some of these games that the defense gave up in the fourth quarter. Talking about Dallas Cowboys at home, Sunday Night Football with their backup QB. Yes, at the time, it was 16-13. And it was, 3rd and 12 or whatever. And if they stop them, they kick a field goal to tie the game, and they gave up a touchdown. You offensively scored 16 points at home. The defense gave up 20. That defense last year was so bad that if they only give up 20 points in a game, that's not on them. I don't care that the last touchdown was scored on them. That doesn't matter. When you have this defense only give up 20 and you lose the game because you only scored 16, I'm sorry. Yes, that gets added to the pot of how many, leads that they gave up within 2 minutes. But I'll also say this. We talked about the Detroit Lions game on our show last year on the road where Jared Goff hits a buzzer beater touchdown to lose the game. The score at the half was 20-6. The Vikings had 4 opportunities in Detroit Lions territory. It was 20-9 midway through the third quarter before the Vikings actually scored their first touchdown. Now, yes, the Vikings scored a touchdown to go up 27-23. But by definition, that means up until that 2-minute drill, the defense had only given up 3 points the entire half. Does that excuse all of these late meltdowns? Absolutely not. But there is the component that I think sometimes people are not looking at is to say, you know what? Here's an idea. The Vikings 98 offense, as great as it was, their defense gave up lots of points because they were already ahead by 30, as an example. So I will say again, there is nobody of consequence on any of those defenses that Daunte had post-2000, other than Antoine Winfield. Who did they have on their defensive line? Chris Hovan, Talance Sawyer. Do you know any of these guys, Mike? Do you remember any of them?
I've heard of Hovan, but only because of a poll that I did a little while ago. So I can't sit here and act like I know who these players are.
I'll ask you to remember the Vikings defensive line last year when they lost Danielle Hunter and how that drastically changed the defense. That defensive line last year, minus Danielle Hunter, was still better than anything that Daunte had outside of maybe 2000. So, for me, I will still say that if you're going to, I would still go Kirk 1 through 4 and then Daunte 5 through 9. But if you want to say that 1 or maybe 2 of the last 2 years you would put below one of Daunte's, that's fine. But by and large, because Kirk had such good defenses his first 2 years and Daunte didn't ever have a good defense, there was never one season where you had a defense like they had in 18 and 19. I will still say that the advantage still goes to Kirk Cousins overall. Would you concur with that, or do you want to argue that point?
I want to add just one last thing. The reason why I put the last 2 years defense behind the Daunte's of 2003, 2004 is because of Mike Zimmer's mentality. And let me explain. He wanted to win close. That was his mindset. He didn't want to win like 98 where they're scoring a ton of points. They could have been that team. He chose to be this run-first 1980s offense that would rely on winning close by defense. That's why I have to put them behind, because even though the talent was better than Daunte's defense, I'm not even going to sit here and say debate that, because it was Pat P, Harrison Smith, Everson Griffin for a stretch, Daniil Hunter. The list goes on and on. They had some solid defensive players, Michael Pierce, you know what I mean?
Eric Kendricks.
The personnel was better. The reason I put them behind was because of Mike Zimmer's mentality. I've never had a bad defense. I'm the man. I'm the cornerback guru, and he failed. That's why the defense goes behind, because he didn't want to win with his offense. That's what screwed the defense over. As a whole, I think they had more talent, but when it mattered most, they were worse.
Well, I will say that if you want to put those two behind, I don't know, pick your season, I can listen to it. But to me, I still would say that the 5 defenses as a whole were still not as good. And in my opinion, nowhere close, but I'll just say they weren't as good as the 4 defenses that Kirk Cousins has on aggregate. So I guess my question to you on this particular point, like we easily conceded that Kirk Cousins by far has the advantage in that scorecard because his offensive lines were terrible. Final ruling for you. Would you still say that Kirk was disadvantaged there, or would you say that Daunte?
No, Daunte more. I can't even lie. Daunte definitely more. At the end of the day, 2018's defense to 29's defense does enough to say that Cousins had better defense as a totality.
All righty, so moving on. Now this one's going to be fun. The skill position players. I have this as a take your pick. Here's my sense. There is nobody on this list higher than Randy Moss, whether it's 2000 or 2004. Excuse me, a little transpositional error there. Let's go ahead and get that fixed. I will say this. In 2000, it was Robert Smith's last season. Chris Carter was in the twilight of his career. This isn't the same Chris Carter that was leading the league in catches during the mid-90s. Was he still effective because he was playing opposite Moss? Sure. But he was not the Chris Carter that we all know. Now, in 2004, there was Randy Moss. Again, Randy Moss missed about 6 games, but, you know, we'll just from a technical standpoint say, okay, well, Randy Moss was still the main receiver. Remember Marcus Robinson, the guy from the Bears that we took for a year and a half? And oh, by the way, do you remember Mo Williams? Mo Williams, by far.
Yes.
Smith, him, and the Dalvin Cook side that we're going to get to. He was by far, and not even close. I don't want to say the worst running back, but I'll say the least talented running back. So, yes, one thing you'll say that is in Kirk's favor is that he had Randy Moss, who was the best of the bunch. Now, let's get to the flip side. Kirk Cousins, for his first 2 seasons, had Diggs, Thielen, and the aforementioned Dalvin Cook. In the last 2 seasons, Jefferson, Thielen, and Cook as well. This is my opinion. While I would say that if you could take an all-time wide receivers, it is no question that it would be Moss and probably Jefferson over Carter at this particular point. You can debate that all you want, but for the sake of this conversation, yes, I would still put Stephon Diggs as the 3rd best, even though it was only a 2-season stretch. I would put Dalvin Cook above Robert Smith and Mo Williams, and I definitely put Thielen above Marcus Robinson. So my question to you is the difference between Moss to Thielen, to Diggs and Jefferson. For me, that amount of difference, whatever amount you want to call it, is certainly less than Thielen and Cook against Carter Smith and Robinson Williams. So to me, it is a take your pick situation. If you ask me to take one, I would probably take 2000 as my first pick, only because it is 3 veteran players who had been in the league. But by far, number 4 on that list is 2004. Now, it doesn't really matter which half of, Cousins you want to go with, regardless of Diggs and Jefferson. To me, they're basically about the same. So once again, we're in a situation where, yes, Daunte had the best and he had the worst, whereas Kirk Cousins had the second best third one. So long-winded way of saying I would probably give the slight edge that Cousins had better weapons over Daunte's aggregately as well. But Mike, what say you on this monstrosity of wide receiver?
So I'm glad you named this, you titled this, as take your pick, because it is very, very difficult to select the winner here. But I'll say this, even though 04's weaponry of Moss, Robinson, and Williams are worse than what Cousins has had to work with. Again, I'm going to repeat this multiple times. The O-line offsets it dramatically because when you have a lot of time to throw, you can make good players look great once in a while in a game. And yes, I know that Vikings team only went 8-8 that season because the defense was poor. I'm not sitting here and saying that team was great, but the offensive line was able to carry it. Similar to how the Vikings needed to win games last year, but in big spots, the O-line was inconsistent when it mattered most, and they couldn't carry it. That's why I give the slight edge to Cullpepper's weaponry and skill position players. Barely, but it's close. But I'm giving it to Cullpepper.
I will say this, to your point about last year's defense that we just went through a minute ago. That 2004 defense, other than Antoine Winfield, didn't have anybody. But last year's defense, and I know you want to give a little bit of that to Mike Zimmer being at fault there. They still had players. They still had Harry, the Hitman. They still had Eric Kendricks, Patrick Peterson. Okay, sure. There was nobody on those defenses. So what I'm saying is, to your point about the offensive line being better, sure, that offensive line was better. But Daunte had to overcome every bit as much of defensive deficiencies as Kirk Cousins has.
Agreed.
I would argue even more. So to me, you're telling me that you would rather have Marcus Robinson and Mo Williams, Chris Carter and Robert Smith over two groups of Adam.
If I can take that offensive line with those weapons at Kirk Cousins, yes, I'm taking them over what Cousins has now. And it's because of also, you got to keep in mind the mentality. I know Mike Tice was not an offensive mind. He was an offensive line coach, as you alluded to. The difference was he let his players play on offense to win games that way. Zimmer never wanted to do that. He wanted to win with defense because he was a defensive coordinator. We all knew it. We talked about this on the Purple Coat Cannon when we were still doing that with myself, you, and Kyla Rose. The difference is there were stretches where they could have done it, and they showed it. The Chargers game last year, the Packers game last year in Minnesota. But the problem was you knew they were never going to sustain it. You knew that Zimmer was too arrogant to allow the offense to win games. That's the problem. If they played it like 04's team where they said, Cousins, go get it done, but obviously Cullpepper then. But same idea, right? Go Cousins, go and get it done with the offense. Different story, but they didn't allow it. That's the problem. That's why I'm so excited for this season, because it is going to be that way.
The other thing that I will point out that I forgot earlier when talking about defenses, as much as we want to talk about the Vikings defense being bad last year and giving up leads in the fourth quarter, the 2003 defense didn't have that problem because they were giving up 42 points to the San Diego Chargers at the time and Doug Flutie at 47 years old. They were giving up 30 points to the, at the time, Oakland Raiders, who had an absolutely atrocious team. So there were a lot of times where the 04 defense gave up ridiculous amount of points. So yeah, you're not going to have a late game collapse when you've given up 40-some points. That defense last year, as bad as it was, didn't give up atrocious amount of points. I think what was their you can look it up as far as how many what game did they have the most points scored. I will say this: the 2004 defense gave up lots of points. So I'm sorry, but as an aggregate, as I said, Randy Moss, he gets the top two slots. The next slots go to Jefferson and Diggs, then Thielen's, then Cook's, and then the rest of them. I'm still going to say that Adam Thielen over the last 4 years is more productive than Chris Carter was in that 2000 season, and certainly more productive than Marcus Robinson. And clearly, you could argue, Robert Smith versus Dalvin Cook. But again, that was only 1 year. Mo Williams, he was a special teamer. He was a guy that came in on third down just to catch a 3-yard pass. He wasn't Leroy Horde. But my point is on aggregate, to me, again, Moss has the top two spots, and then the next 6 spots are taken by Kirk Cousins on there. So I have to, again, I put take your pick on here because it is very, very close. Don't get me wrong. As I said, Daunte had 1 and 4. Kirk had 2 and 3. To me, I'm not going to say that Diggs and Jefferson equaled Moss. But remember, Moss did miss 6 games in 2004. So it's a lot closer than on the surface of, well, Randy Moss.
Agreed.
Hall of Famer and all that. To me, I got to give the edge as much as I can to say that Kirk Cousins had a slightly better time in his 4 years, particularly than the bookends that we're talking about with Daunte Cullpepper. Do you still profess, based on that counter argument, that you would still give the slight edge to Daunte?
By an inch. Like I said, it's so close because they both had problems, as we alluded to. Cullpepper had the O-line, Cousins didn't. Cullpepper didn't have the defense, Cousins did. It's so close. And the coaching goes to Cullpepper. That's where it's so close because the skill position players, you can go both ways. And I'll go as far to say this. This is a real bold take, but I'll say it right now. I think this skill position players that we have this year will be the best of this list in a year's time. I'll go that far. I'll go that bold. But at this moment in time, it's Cullpepper by an inch. And it's so close, but it's Cullpepper by an inch. And the only reason I say that is, like I said, the defense was the mindset. That was the mentality. They wanted to win with defense. They just couldn't do it. And to your question about most points allowed, I believe it was the Arizona game at 34 points. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure that was the one that they allowed the most points.
Yeah, as I said, the Vikings in 09's defense gave up 30s and 40s all over the place. But we'll concede that one as a tie. So I put on here the Mount Rushmore of quarterbacks in the history of the Minnesota Vikings. If any person on this planet or in this galaxy or in this entire universe thinks that Kirk Cousins is already number one ahead of Fran Tarkington, I'm sorry. You can miss me with that because that's just flat out not true.
Yeah.
While Fran Tarkington has played longer for the Vikings, he led all or almost all-time QB records when he retired. Now, I have always said we can't just compare yards and completion percentage and touchdowns between different eras. Fran Tarkington was the 70s. Kramer, was late 70s, early 80s. Cullpepper was early 2000s. Kirk Cousins, 2018 and beyond. Obviously, we know that there is evolution in the NFL. When Fran Tarkington was playing, he revolutionized. No quarterbacks were scrambling quarterbacks, much less as we know them now. Tommy Kramer led this team to just as many division titles. Oh, wait, more division titles than Kirk Cousins. Again, he still got the numbers. Again, record-wise, Kirk Cousins slightly better. But, all three of these guys are hovering a couple games around 500, so we don't have to think about that. Yes, I understand. I'm going to my next slide here. Now, I've got total yards passing that Daunte is ahead of Kirk. Now, I've got 36 total touchdowns ahead because I'm counting the rushing touchdowns in here too because, that counts. Now, Kirk Cousins had one last year. So let's say that Kirk Cousins throws for 4,000 yards and 40 touchdowns. Okay, then he will have the career marks to be passing Daunte Cullpepper. But I will say this. In 2004, he was second to Peyton Manning in MVP. 4,700 yards was the second highest in the NFL. There are so many 4,000-yard quarterbacks here now because it is a passing league. The defenses can't, breathe on quarterbacks without getting roughing the passer calls. The defensive backs can't touch wide receivers. There are so many advantages to offenses in general in this era that were not the case in any one of the three eras, much less, the Daunte Cullpepper era in specific. So to me, you almost have to maybe give an extra, 5 to 10% of all these numbers so that you can adequately compare them from era to era. Now, I don't know how much of a multiplier you would give these other ones, but that's not even really the point right now. My point is this. I have heard the arguments that Kirk Cousins is the most talented wide receiver quarterback in this team's history. I will say that Kirk Cousins had more talent than Tommy Kramer. I might argue that today's talent level versus Fran Tarkington's talent level of that time in the 70s, I still would say it's equal at best.
That's being generous. I'm going to say this now. Even though my Cousins court here, Fran by a mile. I'm sorry. Fran is number one by a country mile. He went to 4 Super Bowls. Cousins hasn't even been close to Super Bowl.
3.
That's that. 3. Sorry, my bad. But regardless, he has done nothing. Cousins has done nothing. That's all my point is when it comes to playoffs. I don't want to hear any fact that I've heard Fran Tarkington and Kirk Cousins compared at all is ridiculous. But yeah.
All right, so back to the issue at hand here. Career-wise, yes, Daunte still has the numbers, and he's probably going to lose those numbers to Kirk Cousins this year. The only way that I will ever say that Kirk Cousins, from a statistical standpoint, is above Daunte is if he gets to about the level of Tommy Kramer, which is only 4,000 yards more. So that isn't really even all that much. Kirk Cousins is supposed to have better numbers than Daunte because of the era he plays in. So to me, it is not just about passing Daunte Cullpepper. Heck, he might pass Fran Tarkington if he's here another 5 years in total touchdowns and passing yards. That isn't the end all be all. Yes, statistics can tell us how to evaluate a player, particularly a quarterback, and that's all well and good. But we cannot just simply say yards, touchdowns. I mean, obviously, where is it? Yeah, Kirk Cousins by far has the best completion percentage. Ain't no doubt about that. These guys threw more interceptions than Kirk Cousins has by a country mile. Daunte, 50 more interceptions in his 5 years. Now, again, it's 4 years versus 5, but I think you get the point. Kirk Cousins absolutely is the safest guy. He is the most consistent guy. But at this particular point, for me, I've already heard people saying that as soon as he passes Daunte in yards and touchdowns, then he definitely has passed Daunte as overall. I'm sorry, I don't particularly buy that. So again, talking about the NFL eras, here's what I'm going to say to end my particular argument here. We already talked about number of total touchdowns and yards. Kirk Cousins also had one last year. For me, the argument is not which one was better. The argument is which one would you rather have in a big moment? The Cousins Bobos are going to say, well, obviously Kirk Cousins, because Daunte would turn the ball over because he had small hands. The Kirk Cousins haters would say, oh, obviously Daunte, because he could do more things than Kirk Cousins does. I'm going to say it like this. Peak Daunte is better than peak Kirk Cousins. Bad Daunte is worse than bad Kirk Cousins. Kirk Cousins has had 4 consistent years. Daunte had 2 good, 1 okay, and 2 awful seasons. So yes, there is an argument to be made as to which one would you rather have, which one had a better career as a Viking. But for me, what I'm saying that my argument is that if I have one game to win, I'm taking Daunte. And he might torpedo the game and lose it big, or he might win the game. But again, it goes back to what we've talked. Daunte's ceiling is here, his floor is here, and somewhere in the middle is where Kirk Cousins is. I would want Daunte Cullpepper if I had to win one game to get into the playoffs, one game to get to the Super Bowl, or obviously the Super Bowl. And you know what? Kirk Cousins definitely is safer. Definitely safer. He's not going to throw as many interceptions as Daunte did. He's not going to have as many fumbles. But my argument as to which one is better is when we go through all of those things, coaching, offensive lines, defense, skill position players, as we have said, they're all very, very close. But again, to me, Kirk Cousins needs to have 2 or 3 more seasons to be then, by the time you adjust the numbers, to be statistically where Daunte is. And I didn't even get to Daunte's rushing numbers. I think we can all just say, yeah, okay, Daunte's a better runner. It's not even close. What say you, Mike? Do you want the safe guy who's on the train, or do you want the guy that has the up and downs? You got to win one game. Who are you picking?
So first, before we get into that, I need to apologize to Joe Cap for not mentioning his Super Bowl appearance. That's on me. That's bad on me. That's on me. I should know better. Second off, it's Cousins, and it's only Cousins because, like I've said, this season will be the year he defines himself as the second greatest quarterback to play for Vikings. And I know it's bold. But I think he will surpass Daunte Cullpepper. He will win 11 games this season, and he will win a playoff game. And that, to me, will cement him ahead of Cullpepper. Now, we'll see how it goes the rest of the way after that playoff win, but that's the minimum expectation for me, and I think that happens. And then Kevin O'Connell will bring the best out of Kirk Cousins, and we'll see career year. If we don't, that's a totally different story, but that's why I expect Kirk Cousins to be the guy I'm taking, not only now, but long-term, because I think he will blow out Cullpepper when it's all said and done. I really do. I think he will break all of Cullpepper's records, passing touchdowns of the season, yards, all of it. I'm convinced.
Now, let me be clear. I'm talking about right now. I'm not necessarily talking about when their career. when I am doing a comparison as to an all-time, whether it's a wide receiver, like some people want to say that Justin Jefferson after 2 years has already passed everybody, Randy Moss, maybe Moss. He has not passed him out of shot. He has not passed right. I would say right now he's Jake Reed, who had 1,000-yard seasons. But my point is, when I do a comparison with active players versus players, I have to pretend in my mind, ostensibly, that the active player will never play another game, because that is the only way you can have a way of evaluating. You can't say, well, here's the guy who's inactive, here's the guy who's active, and I think the active guy is going to be this. So that is how I come to be clear. I am not saying that Kirk Cousins can't have Daunte. I'm just saying, for my opinion, he has. To your point, yes, if Kevin O'Connell has leadership and ability to play quarterback that Kirk Cousins has not had in 18 years, 2 total head coaches, okay, like I said, we reevaluate this at the year. Or 2 years from now, I would think, yeah, he probably has the best. But to me, the trump card, and I know that there are some that absolutely despise wins. I'm not saying QB wins, because they're very good. To me, what separates Daunte Cullpepper Lambeau Field and won 31-7. They blew that. Yes, had Randy Moss. Yes, Burles. Still had Mo Williams. Kirk Cousins went to New Orleans. Overtime game because the defense better. What happened in the following? They both got destroyed. I believe in 2017, in Daunte year in 2010, Kirk Cousins. Bottom line, they both lost in the Super Bowl. Clear about that. So I think those two playoffs as being relatively equal. Right, it's Daunte because Green Bay, but none of them. Now, my trump card, the fact that the playoffs twice, and he went there and while they got destroyed in the NFC Championship, they got to the championship game. They pretty much beat New Orleans in their division round. Granted, at home, that was of the 4 playoff games divisional round. That was the only one the Vikings. So again, Daunte has that advantage, but he has that advantage team in that position. So all I'm going to say, yes, you and I have said our expectation for this season is that you have to get to the division round. Otherwise, and that's what the show to do. That's because the expectations that put on themselves being over on that. So to me, now I'm still on the NFC Championship. To me, and it's to me, more than past what the difference is that we've just one for this guy, this one for this guy. If there is a amount that you would give Kirk, it is trumped by. What say you?
So right now, I'll sit here and say Cousins is better only because that NFC title game to me almost doesn't count because Daunte was awful. He threw 3 interceptions. They were blown out. If Cousins did the same thing, no one would care. I mean, at the end of the day, I don't consider an NFC championship appearance you score 0 points an accomplishment. I really don't. And that's where, again, Cousins has a better winning record as a whole. He has better statistics as a whole. I think he is better than Daunte Cullpepper. And the reason why, even though the errors is equivalent a little bit for the yards and touchdowns, and I'll concede that, at the same time, they were similar to the K-Con Bills offense and the Dolphins offense with Marino, where they were ahead of their time. And I don't think it's fair to just say, well, it was early 2000s, so their stats are supposed to be diminished and a little bit lower. And yes, do I think that Daunte was very impressive for his era? Absolutely. But I think Cousins edges him just because I think he's just as good. In my personal opinion, he's better in every which way, aside from maybe running ability. But Cousins, in my opinion, is a better scrambler than he gets credit for, too. Now, his Cullpepper beats him there. But as well, that's why I take Cousins, because that playoff win against New Orleans, to me, is equivalent to the 2 wins because I almost don't count the win he did in 2000. He's got blown out. Threw 3 interceptions in the NFC title game. Cousins did that, I'd be criticizing him, and I'd be bashing him. That is worse than anything Cousins has ever done in his career in Minnesota, in my personal opinion.
Well, I'll have one final, then we'll ask the question of each other, whether one of us is convinced the other, or we're still going to call it a dead heat. I'll say this to your point. First of all, I'd love to see Kirk Cousins throw in an NFC championship. Get back to me when he – not all his fault, not all Daunte's praise. But I will say this. I'll remind people that in the second to last game, Daunte Cullpepper suffered a high ankle sprain. Now, he didn't play much in the last game here. I think they played a quarter. He won that game at home with a high ankle sprain. He went on the road to the New York Giants, who absolutely shredded that awful defense that Daunte carried. Well, Daunte lost. The whole offense carried. Daunte Cullpepper had in that game. I will remind people that the Giants won the toss, scored a touchdown. Vikings fumbled, Giants another touchdown. So before Daunte even saw the field, they're down 14-0. And guess what? All the Kirk Bobo, our good friend Joe, if Kirk Cousins got to an end and was down 14 before he ever touched the ball, that would completely involve Cousins. Kirk Cousins could throw 5 receptions that game, and it was, well, he got on the field. And guess what? He got on the field down 14 game. You imagine the heaping praise that the Bobos would do. So all I'm going to say is this. Yes, you're right. That game was atrocious. You can't say it doesn't count there.
I think it offsets it. It just offsets the idea of getting there because he didn't do anything. He threw less touchdowns in an NFC title game than Case Keenum. You know what I mean? Like, that's where like I said, I think that's why I'm with Cousins. Even though the consistency sometimes annoys me because he doesn't hit the ceiling that I probably think he can, he is consistent and he doesn't tank. That's the difference. That's why I think it's close, but I just give him the edge. I do.
Well, if you want to say he's thrown more touchdowns in the game than Daunte Cullpepper, that kind of sort of applies because he hadn't been to one. Like I said, Case Keenum was lucky to get one. Had that first half just dominating and then dominating and play whatever. Probably you can make whatever argument they should have won that game or not. So are we going to invalidate Keenum's NFC Championship game? They lost 38-7.
I do that. I've done that. I've said they were embarrassed. It was the same idea. Now I was being a little bit tongue in cheek when I said that Case Keenum's thrown more touchdowns than Daunte Cullpepper in the NFC Championship game because it was when they were up 7-0 and they proceeded to concede 38 unanswered points. But it still applies now. I will say this, and you can hold me to this, and so can everyone who's listening to this video. Kirk Cousins, if he ever gets to an NFC title game, which is a big if, but if he does, I guarantee he will throw a touchdown. I guarantee it. Right now. I guarantee it.
You're really going out on the limb. But having said all, if you say that the championship games don't count, the Super Bowls don't count because they destroyed. They will never get.
It was a little different. They did score points. Like when you score a donut, a legitimate donut, nothing, not even a single point, not even a field goal. That's where I just completely almost say it's irrelevant. But that's just me. Some people disagree with me and say I'm nuts, but that's my opinion.
Yeah, they scored 7 against Kansas City. They scored 14 to the Raiders. They gave up 6 got 6 whole points from the Steelers. And frankly,
well, they got blown on. I know they got blown on every single one. I know, but they didn't score 0.
Well, having said all that, if Kirk Cousins gets to an championship this season, argument's done. They missed the playoff. I still take Daunte.
Oh, yeah, then it could turn on them. I'll admit that. I will concede that it could turn on them.
This is the season. You either prove everybody wrong, prove everybody right. Leave it at that. So I'm going to guess, Mike, I have not turned you to the side. I can definitely tell you haven't. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Shocker. 2 guys. Well, we're going to wrap it at this. We're going to wrap it at the draw. Like I said, Rinaldi's Imposter Woodbury, as well as Nautical Golden Woodbury. Lights on. Again, the purple will be covered all week during the regular season, hopefully playoff as well. I just want to say this: subscribe on Facebook. If you have comments on this, by all means, throw us in there. Tell us what your arguments are. Tell me how wrong I am. Tell me how right I am. Like a Patriot, we'd all love to know why your arguments are wrong. And at the end of it, we all love to hear that Kirk is best, because that means at least he's to an NC championship game, maybe even to a Super Bowl. Because as we say, as we wrap this up, the only thing that this show will like to win one Super Bowl, we die. Thanks again for tuning in. Keep your eyes out. We're going to do content here shortly, and we'll look at what our shows are going to be the season there. Mike, it's been a pleasure. As always.
Yeah.
Thanks again.